and welcome to the ACR Journals on Air podcast. I am your host, Vicky Shamagam. The title I wanted to use for today's podcast has been trademarked, so I cannot say it, but having collated many patient-reported outcome questionnaires, I'm sure I'm not alone in wondering whether there might be a better way to collect patient-reported data, not just for research, but also for patient care. The manuscript we will discuss today is a mobile health application integrated into the electronic health record for rheumatoid arthritis patient-reported outcomes, a controlled, interrupted, time series analysis of impact on visit efficiency. It was published in Arthritis and Rheumatology, and a link to the manuscript and disclosures are in our show notes from today. I'm thrilled to be joined by the manuscript's first author and editor of Arthritis and Rheumatology, Dr. Daniel Solomon. Dr. Solomon is professor and the Matthew H. Liang Distinguished Chair in Arthritis and Population Health at Harvard Medical School and the Brigham and Women's Hospital. Dr. Solomon received his medical degree from Yale Medical School and subsequently completed residency and fellowship at the Brigham and Women's Hospital and Harvard Medical School. He is an accomplished physician scientist. His research focuses on drug effectiveness and safety, osteoporosis, and the cardiovascular implications of rheumatoid arthritis. He has published over 400 articles, chaired the US FDA's Arthritis Advisory Committee, and led the ACR Blue Ribbon panel on NSAID use. He has also been editor of Arthritis and Rheumatology since 2020 and has instituted many innovations in the journal, including this podcast. Welcome to the show, Dan.
Oh, thanks for having me, Vicky. It's a pleasure.
So, as an innovator, I wanted you to kickstart us with a bit of the story behind this research. Patients feel empowered when they can understand their symptoms. It gives them back some control in the context of living with a chronic disease. And we know that evaluating patient outcomes improves patient outcomes. So, what was the knowledge gap that your study was trying to fill?
Thanks for asking. We've been at this trying to develop applications for collecting patient-reported outcomes, PROs, for about 5 to 6 years. And this came out of a realization that using some digital health technology should really enhance clinicians' ability to understand how their patients are doing between visits and allow patients to more fully grasp how they're doing on a daily, weekly basis. We know patients enjoy this. They feel better in control of their disease when they can easily chart their disease symptoms and look at this longitudinally and easy to use graphics. And as clinicians, we know that we're often asking patients to look back over the last 3 to 6 months of symptoms. And wouldn't it be wonderful if that can all be happening in a more automated and seamless way? And so about 6 years ago, I sat down with some of my colleagues, Michael Weinblatt and Yvonne Lee, who at the time was at the Brigham, and we started thinking about how we could develop a mobile health application to achieve this. And we had some ideas, and then we spent some time in focus groups with patients and clinicians. And our first iteration was a very simple app that Yvonne Lee tested in a trial that was published, I believe, about 3 or 4 years ago on rheumatoid arthritis and how patients report their symptoms. And we continue to iterate on that concept with patient focus groups, clinician focus groups, and really using principles of user-centered design so we could better understand how to fit the collection of PRO data through an app into the clinical workflow. And this was really, again, trying to address patients' desire to understand their own symptoms and visualize those symptoms, communicate those symptoms, and to allow clinicians to use that information seamlessly in their clinical practice. That's really the rub, is trying to integrate that information into clinical practice is really tricky and hasn't been done all that well in the past.
Yeah, no, that's so true. And I'm so glad to hear that your team is advocating for moving beyond the patients filling out paper and pencil questionnaires in the waiting room. Your study team really also took this one step further beyond just point of care collection of patient reported outcome measures to between visit collection. Tell us what the intervention involved.
Sure. So the app that we've developed, this is now version 3 of what we call RheumApp. And RheumApp has been designed for rheumatoid arthritis and now extended to psoriatic arthritis. But the app is a very simple app, and this is very intentional. So it prompts the patient on a frequency that the patient prefers every day, every other day, every week to answer specific PRO questionnaires: pain interference, function, fatigue, RA disease activity, or now psoriatic disease activity. And those questionnaires are pushed through a reminder to a patient's phone or their tablet. They fill those out at their leisure. They usually take under a minute to fill out. And that information is then made available to the clinician. It's also made available to the patient in the form of a longitudinal graphic, which has green, yellow, orange, and red shaded regions on the graphic so the patient can understand if they're in remission or somewhere in between or doing very poorly. And then on the back end, we allow clinicians to view this data in the electronic health record through a viewer, which is a very simple set of technologies using APIs that allow clinicians to see the data. And then we have some back-end logic built in that tells clinicians, A, if the patient's doing poorly and might need an early visit, if the patient's absolutely stable and you might delay the visit, or just simply the patient has data in the app that's viewable and you should look at it before the patient visits. So it's kind of a simple patient interface, a simple clinician interface that we think is now well integrated within the clinical workflow.
And share with our listeners some more information about the clinical populations that you recruited for this study. Where did they come from? What were their ages? Just a little bit of background.
Sure. Yeah, they're typical RA population. So the paper we're talking about today is focused on rheumatoid arthritis. We recruited 150 patients seen at the Brigham with rheumatoid arthritis. We have several thousand rheumatoids that are seen chronically at the Brigham, so it's not hard to recruit. Sitting in the waiting room, a research assistant approaches a patient after they've received an informational letter, and their clinicians have said it's okay for us to approach them. They approach them, they consent them, and then they download the app onto the patient's phone or tablet. And then the patient gets a small honorarium for downloading it and going to the trouble of doing the consent, et cetera. And then, so the patients really look like typical rheumatoids. You know, their age is, about 60. Most of them are women, and their racial and ethnic distribution looks very similar to our total clinic population. So it's a very representative, somewhat randomly group population, but it's not a randomized controlled trial. And then we actually matched our patients. The 150 that we recruited, we matched them to 150 patients that we never had a chance to approach. We matched them on age and gender and prior experience in the clinic. So they end up looking very similar to the patients who received the app, but the control group just didn't receive the app.
And you describe the study design as a controlled, interrupted time series analysis. What does that actually mean?
Yeah, so interrupted time series analyses are a commonly used design, especially with this sort of an intervention, which is not like a drug intervention. It's an intervention that you disseminate through a clinic, through a practice. And oftentimes, the best way to recruit people who didn't receive the intervention, i.e., controls, is to match them in some way. Often, this is not done in a randomized fashion. And then we think about the intervention, i.e., the app, as the interruption in the interrupted time series. So we're able to date when the patients receive the app. or we're able to date a matching date for the control arm. And then we look in the 12 months before this date to see what their visit distribution looked like, what their visit volume looked like, and in the 12 months after. So there's an interruption, the app, there's a control group that are matched, and we look at this time series, the year before and the year after, to see whether the slopes differ across the two periods and whether the slopes differ across the two groups, the ones receiving the app versus the controls.
And I'm going to confess, as I was reading your paper, I did a quick search to see if I could find your app. I think it's called Room App, but I couldn't find it on my phone. What is it, and who develops it? Was it your team or a company?
Yeah, sure. It's a great question. And it is not available. Right now, we have our psoriatic arthritis app available. So because this is a study, we don't... we believe that apps should be intensively studied before they're let out in the free world, so to speak. And so we make the app available during the study for patients who receive a code. They can then download the app. And now we're doing that with psoriatic arthritis. Our hope is, if we believe this app really works and is acceptable to patients and clinicians, then to actually make it freely available in the app stores, but it's not at this point. And the app has been developed by our team in collaboration with some software developers. And it's not, again, the app is a very streamlined, relatively modest app that doesn't do a lot, but it's graphically, the design has been very careful graphically, and so patients can understand it intuitively and not spend a lot of time on instructions. And it's integrated within the EHR, which is really unusual for apps like this.
Mm-hmm. And what patient outcome measures are actually included in the app? And then kind of follow up to that question, how often do people have to go in and fill them out?
Yeah. So we, again, spent a lot of time in focus groups, using principles of user-centered design to figure out which PROs and how many PROs and how often to trigger the PROs. And we came, it's kind of the Goldilocks principle. Like, some patients want fewer, some patients want more. And we found that 4 different PROs was kind of an ideal number. We use validated PROs from the PROMIS library of PRO measures. So again, the pain interference, function, and fatigue. And we use the short form. So they're 4 to 5 items. It takes really under a minute to complete these. And then we use the 4th PRO is a disease activity that's specific to the disease. So the RA Disease Activity Index, short form, 5 items, or the PSED-12 for psoriatic arthritis. So those are the 4 for each of the different diseases. The patient has the ability to set their preference on how often they receive one of these questionnaires, daily, every other day, et cetera, up to once a week. And then we only trigger one at a time. They don't have to fill in all 4 of them on a given day. They fill in one on a given day. And if they do it every other day, that means that in an 8-day cycle, they're filling out each of the PROs. So on a approximately weekly basis, they collect that information on themselves. They can display it for themselves, and then we can feed it into the doc through the electronic health record.
Yeah, and this app went one step further. So within that interface with the electronic health record was some logic that then generated prompt messages to the providers in the EHR. Can you tell us about those alerts and the logic decision trees that you put in?
Sure. Yeah. This is, I like to think of it as a secret sauce to the app. And there's 3 in-basket messages. If you're an Epic user, you know that these are kind of the encrypted internal emails that you get, but all the EHRs have something similar at this point. So we can use this with any EHR. It's EHR agnostic, and there's 3 different messages that get triggered. The first one is very simple. It's, your patient has a visit in 2 days. They have data in the PRO app. Please look at it. So we just want to remind docs to look at the PRO data, just like they would look at labs or any intercritical visits that occurred between their visits. So one is just there's data. The second one is the patient, this gets triggered if there's several sequential PRO results that are in the severe range. Then we actually just trigger an in-basket message that says your patient seems to be doing poorly. Would you like to schedule an early visit? It doesn't schedule the early visit. It asks the doc if they would like to schedule an early visit, and then they can forward that message to their scheduler and try to fit the patient in. And that was done very intentionally. Docs did not want the app to schedule an early visit. Mm-hmm. They wanted the option to do their scheduling because sometimes they know the patient, very well, and they know that patients have a hiccup in their symptoms and they want to let it go a week or two and just see what happens. And then the third in-basket message is designed for improving efficiency in rheumatologic care. And this is, it asks the doc if they want to delay a visit. So 2 weeks before a visit, the app runs a scan of the data, and it says if the data are all stable within a standard deviation of what their baseline data look like, then they ask the doc, your patient appears stable based on their PROs. Would you like to delay the visit? If so, forward this message to your scheduler. And that's really, part of what we're doing here is trying to improve the efficiency of rheumatologic care, seeing patients when they need to get seen and not seeing them when they don't need to get seen. And, we all know there's a huge person power issue in rheumatic disease care. And so we see this as kind of part of trying to change the model of care. And the app is a tool for trying to do that, is trying to make the care more efficient. So there's a delay visit, an early visit, and there's data in your PRO app. Go look at it. Those are the 3 in-basket messages that we trigger.
And what were the actual outcomes that you measured? Was it patient satisfaction? Was it provider satiffaction? Or was it this?
All the above, Vicki, because, there hasn't been a lot of work in this area and definitely not rigorous controlled work. So we just thought we had to measure everything as much as we can do without angering the patients and the docs. So we measured satisfaction there's validated app satisfaction scales for docs, for patients. We did focus groups during and after. We also did some one-on-one questionnaires with the docs and the patients before, during, and after. And then we measured visit volume because we were curious to see if our messages might delay visits and therefore produce a reduction in the visits after the so-called interruption using the beginning of using the app. And we also looked at processes of care. So were there more or less DMARD changes? What did the PRO measures look like over the course of the study? And we're still analyzing some of those data. We report on our primary outcome, which we said was volume of visits. And I can get there in a minute, but I do think it's really important for people to recognize that this is kind of proof of concept work. There hasn't been a lot of work like this in outpatient subspecialty care, full stop, and definitely not in rheumatology. And so we thought it was really important just to see if docs would go along with this, if patients would go along with this, and that they weren't angry being asked to do all this. And I'm happy to talk about those results.
Yeah, no, I think we should talk about the results next. And I guess first off, I always like to have a little bit of discussion about the figures that you present in the manuscript. And you had 2 figures 2 and 3, that have some pretty striking data. I wondered if you could describe them for our listeners.
Sure. Yeah, figure 2 is kind of the main results table in which we show the interruption in the time series. So we show the 12 months before the app was deployed and the 12 months after, and we show data for people who are non-users, the control arm, and the users, the people using the app. And what you can see in figure 2, and I'll describe it to you, so if you don't have the paper in front of you, but you can see that that the visit volume on a monthly basis was quite similar in the 12 months before the app was deployed. at the time when the app is deployed, the people have a visit. And we matched the controls. They had to have a visit at the same period. So everybody's visit volume spikes at the interruption by design. And then we looked to see if the visit volume would change after the interruption, and it did not. So while we were able to get the app triggered many messages, delayed visit messages were about 110 across the 150 patients during the year. So the app works in how it's supposed to work. Procedurally, it's successful, but it didn't prompt a delay in visits that would have produced a downslope in the visit volume in the app group. And, this was disappointing, but not that surprising. And, we can get more into that in a minute, but I'll describe the figure 3, which was the 4 different PROs, the pain, function, fatigue, and the RADI. And those were all remarkably stable over the 12 months. And this was good. We didn't pick patients who were flaring at the time that they got the app. We picked patients who were relatively stable. And so they stayed stable. The app didn't make their care miraculously better or worse. It was stable. And that, to us, that was comforting. I think if we had recruited patients while they were flaring, we would have seen different results. But that was not really our goal here. It was just to see that the patients were filling in their PROs and the PROs were relatively stable.
And what did you find in the response to all those electronic health record messages? When you drilled into the data, did the messages actually impact kind of provider decision making, or were you able to truly measure that?
Yeah, it's a great question. And we debated how to design this. And because we really were trying to integrate this in typical clinical workflow, we didn't prompt the docs to answer questions in the middle of their busy day. We didn't say, did you like this message? What'd you do with this message? Because our busy clinicians just said, we're not going to do that, Solomon. We like you. We think this is interesting, but sorry. So we didn't ask them. We just tried to observe what they did. And again, there were 110 prompts for delayed visit, about 35 for early visit. And of those 110 delay visit, about 20% actually had a delayed visit. So on the one hand, you'd say, wow, that seemed to work. But this is the beauty of doing a controlled study, because when you look at controls, they themselves have about 20% delayed visits. Because in an academic practice, as you know, Vicki, docs are traveling, docs are giving lectures, docs are doing things, and visits get delayed for lots of reasons. And so the rate of delay was no greater in the app arm than in the control arm. So if we had done this study in a less rigorous manner without a control arm, I would have been telling you that we just, figured out sliced bread. We figured out something that was going to change medical care. But the control arm lets us know that, we haven't done that yet. We think that this is really, that we're onto something, and that the issue that we've hit upon is that docs in academic practice have a lot of barriers to behavior change. They're not as motivated as docs in typical clinical practice with a lot of the aspects of this app that are the strengths, i.e., we can move the patient distribution from return visits to new visits. And if you're a doc in a busy practice, you want more new visits because you want to reduce your wait times, and B, you actually get paid better for new patient visits than return visits. So we think that our next step is actually taking this out into the quote unquote real world. And we've had the beginnings of discussions with some busy practices who are interested in trying this out. So that's one of the things that we think is exciting about the app. The other thing, which is something that not a lot of people in rheumatology are thinking about, but this is actually a tool to do remote therapeutic monitoring, RTM. And if you follow CMS and reimbursement, CMS has realized that doing in between monitoring of patients and observing those data and managing patients and their medications based on those data that are obtained remotely is really important. And in like 2022, they paid out $100 million to docs to do this. And I don't think anybody in rheumatology is doing it that I can find. And we actually think that this app is a tool for RTM that, it has to be tested. We didn't do that at the Brigham because a big academic medical center is not a very aggressive biller. And so that's why we're trying to take this out into other practices.
Yeah, and actually, as I was kind of thinking about your study, I had a couple of follow-up questions. As a physician who has, certainly received my fair share of portal and electronic health record alerts, do you think part of the challenge is that in a academic health center, the physician cannot necessarily execute on the necessary scheduling changes? Most docs are at the mercy of their institution's scheduling system, and it's just not feasible for them to start taking on rebooking of stable patients because their priority has to be fitting in the patients with sort of upticks in symptoms.
Vicki, I think you're absolutely right that a large academic medical center like the Brigham or GW or any of the ones that we know well, they have bureaucracies that are sometimes hindering us from improving efficiencies in care. I say that quietly because I don't think that the administrators of our institutions like to hear that. But if you go to, a rheumatology practice that runs their scheduling function, these things happen much differently. And so I'm excited to see whether the app might improve efficiencies in kind of real world practice in a way that's quite different than we would observe in academic practice. And, 80% of rheumatologists are out in the real world, not in academic practices. So that's really, to me, a major target audience for this app.
Mm-hmm. And one last follow-up question on the study, because I couldn't find it in your manuscript. Did you look at all at the provider side of the dyads? So were there any characteristics on the provider end that distinguished the controls and the intervention arm, or that you could picked out those individuals who were likely to have more aggressive responses to those EHR messages?
Yeah, no, that's actually work that we're currently doing, analyzing the data in a lot of detail, trying to understand doctor attitudes and their response to the app. So you ask a great question, and I have a behavioral scientist helping me with those analyses, and that's not part of this first manuscript. We selected the controls kind of trying to match on rheumatologists because we didn't think it would be fair if we chose patients seeing different rheumatologists, right? So we duplicated the 11 rheumatologists in the control arm that were in the intervention app arm. So that's not different, but we did look at variations across those 11 physicians. And I can tell you a couple of preliminary observations that I think are quite interesting. When patients report that their docs showed them the data at visits, so the doc would go in and open up the PRO tab and look at the data with the patient, helping them to use those data to make management decisions. Patients loved it, A, and B, they were much higher in their adherence to the app. So our overall adherence was between 60 and 65%, which is like much, much better than the typical 30 to 40% of an app. So we had very high adherence, relatively speaking, and it was even higher when the patients recognized that their docs used the data. And we also found that there was some docs that had a little bit more gray hair that were less likely to use the data. So we're actually in the psoriatic arthritis study that we're currently doing, we've not just focused on 11 busy docs, we've given the app to the patients of all 40 practicing rheumatologists at the Brigham, because we know that a lot of the younger rheumatologists are very interested in these data and may not be as busy clinically, but they might actually respond more to the in-basket messages and the data. So we're interested to see how that experience is going to differ from the RA trial that we just completed.
Yeah, I think that type of analysis is so interesting. And this kind of concept of it really matters. We've seen that in other arenas, that dyad, the patient-physician dyad of, how, I guess what you were measuring is the chemistry between the patient and the physician and how they interact with data pertaining to the illness. So I'm excited to see what you find there.
Thanks. Yeah, no, I think we're excited to see. I will just put a plug in that a lot of people are interested in apps and mobile health technologies, and there's very few rigorous studies.
Yeah. And no regulation, correct? Like, this isn't a medical device. You're not going to have to get FDA approval in the way you would a device, correct?
Well, it's a good question you ask. The current app in its current form is definitely not regulated because we're not trying to bill using it.
Uh-huh.
And we're not giving medical advice in the app. But we think that the next version of this, because we want to allow clinicians to pursue remote therapeutic monitoring, that does require an FDA review.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're now currently undergoing work with a consultant who is looking over the app and writing a report that will help us in that review with the FDA that will allow the clinicians that use the future version of the app to do some billing for remote therapeutic monitoring. So most apps that you find in the App Store, no, they're not regulated. But if you want to go for this further ability with the app, then you need to go through a process of software as a medical device, which is an FDA regulated segment of devices of medical health technologies.
Oh, excellent. I'm so glad you explained that to us. So I want to thank you, Dan, for being brave enough to kind of push this through to publication because, at first glance, it is essentially a negative study. I had a question and answer both as an author, I guess, and as an editor. Was it tough to get it through the peer review process or did they go easy on you?
That's a loaded question because as the editor, I have to say that as the editor of A&R, I have not submitted many papers to A&R because I feel somewhat uncomfortable that people will go easy on me. And I don't want to be accused of filling A&R with papers from my research group. So I haven't published as much in A&R during my tenure as I had in prior years. So I first want to make note of that. But secondly, I thought this was a really important paper for an American rheumatology journal like A&R because it's done in the US. So I didn't want to send it elsewhere. And did they go easy on us? No, we got as difficult a review as, we give to all authors. We had to redo some analyses and figures and I think that they recognized the novelty and they recognized the rigor and they recognize the potential clinical relevance. And so it made it through the review process. But you're right that our hypothesis was about visit volume. And so I can't call it anything but a negative study, but there's so many, little pieces of interesting data that I think are potential positives that I think the reviewers recognize that.
Yeah, no, and I think it's really important for our audience to hear that. I'm going to warn you that even though you are editor of Arthritis and Rheumatology, you are not exempt from my wrap-up questions, which I do ask of pretty much everyone who comes on this podcast because our listeners really like to get to know the people behind the papers. So first up is one that I ask of almost everyone, which is, why did you become a rheumatologist?
Sure. I became a rheumatologist based on some interactions with people during medical school, a really great rheumatologist at Yale named Leo Cooney, who did a lot of geriatrics work, was just a wonderful clinician, very thoughtful doctor and academic. And then during my internship, I came into contact with some great cases and great rheumatologists, and it really kind of set me on a path towards rheumatology. I also knew that I was interested in being a clinical researcher, and rheumatology lends itself so well to being a clinical researcher and clinician. I still practice. I have a very active clinic and do consults, and love that work, but really love the clinical research work. So rheumatology has been a great avenue for me.
Yeah. And so tell us about that. You've had this long, distinguished academic career in clinical outcomes research. What prompted you to enter the digital health space?
It's, I I think we all recognize that our lives have been changed over the last decade by having computers in our pocket, an iPhone or what have you. And so it just felt like this was an opportunity to potentially improve clinical care, improve measurements, there's just interesting, innovative opportunities that people are trying to figure out how to garner and harness. And so that's who I am. I kind of like about the next idea. And I'm not a tech innovator myself, but I think I can think about how to apply innovations to real clinical questions. And this is something that really sometimes gets in my bonnet about technology. I think oftentimes it's technology searching for a question.
Mm-hmm.
Here I feel like there was a clear clinical problem, collection of PROs between visits in a way that docs can use the data and patients can feel good about collecting it. That's a very easy to understand issue for all docs and patients. And that's what we took on. We didn't take on like interesting technology. We took on a clinical question and tried to figure out how to use technology in a way that was logical and facilitated better care.
Yeah, I love it. And I love that you're iterating on that as well. I wondered if I could change direction and talk a little bit about your tenure as the editor-in-chief for Arthritis and Rheumatology. How did you get selected for the job? Is it something you apply for, or is it like the Nobel Prize where you're nominated and then suddenly get a phone call in the middle of the night?
It's definitely not like the Nobel Prize. No, there's an application, a pretty rigorous application process that I went in for. And, the Committee on Journal Publications, the CJP, which is part of the ACR, reviews all the applications. And I was luckily selected. I had served on the journal as an associate editor and then a deputy editor and a co-editor. So I had kind of 10 years of history on the editorial team. And so by the time I applied for this in 2019, 2020, I kind of really had a clear vision of what I would do as an editor-in-chief. And I think that allowed me to compete successfully for the position.
Yeah, and though you're good at predicting the future, you applied for the position in 2019. You took over as editor-in-chief in 2020. So in the thick of COVID, what was that like? What did you learn? How did that change what you were able to get done?
Yeah, these are all great questions. And we had to learn on the fly because COVID was presenting such challenges. But, Rick Bucala had been the prior editor-in-chief, and we had plans on a transition in February, March, April. There's a set of manuscripts and associate editors that are part of his team. And then, I had a slightly different team of associate editors, and new manuscripts would come in. And because I was very familiar with the process, serving as a deputy editor under Rick, it was not a big transition process in February or March of 2020. But as you mentioned, oh yeah, by the way, COVID hit. And so, Rick is a division chief at Yale and does a lot in therapeutic innovation. So he really was eager to focus on immunotherapies for COVID. And so he was happy to hand it over quickly and let me take over. And to be honest, because we were all sitting at home trying to figure out our next move, it wasn't such a awful time to take over. The journal is run completely remotely, and so it's easy to do with a laptop and a good internet connection. And that's how we function in good times. And during COVID, it was no different. So we took over, And our AE team knew we had a lot of issues to deal with. We got flooded with manuscripts that
Mm-hmm.
were COVID related. And, we had great AEs that took those on and did a great job. And I think it just, it was exciting and interesting time to be an editor. It was a very fraught time to be a clinician, to be a
Mm-hmm.
person. But, we felt like we had an obligation to try to serve the community, giving information that was rigorous most of the time, sometimes a little less rigorous than we would have liked because we kind of had to get some data out. So there was more case series as opposed to controlled studies
Yeah.
being published. And, we were part of that because we felt like that was an important public health service.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting to hear from your point of view how that rolled out. I wonder, do you have any tips for people thinking about becoming journal editors? What do you wish you'd known before you started on that part of your journey?
Tips. Yeah, I mean, things that I've learned sometimes the hard way is, always smile. People don't always show their best angels when they have their paper rejected and they're rebutting. And the best thing you can do is smile and say thank you for submitting to A&R
Mm-hmm.
and then take their concerns seriously. And you see a lot of the pressures that academics go through in the interactions they have with their journals. So that's pretty interesting. I mean, I'm a psychologically minded person, so I don't usually mind seeing people at their best or at their worst. It's just, part of being a person, part of being a human. A lot of the journal runs like a complicated train system, and keeping the trains running takes a lot of well trained staff. And you don't always see that from the outside, but from the inside, that's obvious. And we have ACR has well trained staff that run the internal workings of the journal and make the experience pleasant for authors, reviewers, and editors. And that's really important to recognize. And I think another important observation is that, in 2024, the good news is there's a lot of rheumatology journals. And if you're
Mm-hmm.
not published in A&R, you're going to get published. But that's also the bad news is that there's a lot of rheumatology journals, some of them really not so great. And that has put some interesting pressures on A&R and kind of academic society publishing that are going to be challenges for the next editor.
Yeah. So before we get to kind of innovations and what the future might hold, I need to ask you a very fundamental question that is incredibly important to the future of science. And that is what all of our listeners want to know. How do people get selected as reviewer two? And more importantly, how can authors improve their own outcomes when reviewer two is flaring?
Yeah, so I think Vicky, you're referring to like the nasty reviewer too, who doesn't like your paper. As anybody who has worked at a journal knows, you really want critical reviewers. So our associate editors handle the manuscripts, and they have their list of favorite reviewers, some of them being easy and some of them being hard. And I think the associate editors know how to pick a mix. We also obviously rely on authors to give us a list of potential reviewers. Sometimes they say, please don't send it to these reviewers. And sometimes we send it to those reviewers but we take their reviews with a grain of salt. We know that there's been some history, but I have to tell you that authors really usually have no idea who their friends are and who their enemies are, because it's just kind of interesting to observe the favored reviewers and the unfavored reviewers and how those reviews actually go. But we pick experts in the field. We have a great stable of reviewers that are willing to help us, and they do a great job. So that's really why A&R publishes high quality manuscripts.
Yeah. And as editor in chief, you've obviously innovated extensively. Tell us about some of the new initiatives that you've initiated during your tenure.
Yeah. So a couple that I'll point out, we've focused on social media and podcasts. So this was an idea that Rick and I had 7 years ago. It took a while for the ACR to get the procedures in order. And now we're doing the ACR Journals podcast, which is great. We also have a social media editor and a staff person who feeds graphical abstracts. So graphical abstracts is another innovation that we put in place using BioRender, which is a graphics company that we give authors the access to create really good-looking graphical abstracts. We send those out on Twitter and X. We have narrated graphical abstracts that are on YouTube. So we really try to get our great material out through as many channels as possible. That's kind of number one innovation. There's an article type that we developed, which I really like, called Expert Perspectives on Clinical Challenges. This is like a very clinically oriented review article written by experts. How do you treat difficult Sjogren's disease or lupus nephritis or vasculitis? That kind of you can't really find it in a review, in a systematic lit review. You can't find it in a guideline. And it's from the point of view of an expert. And so we do about 4 to 5 of those a year, and those have been well received. We also have journal club articles selected each month where the authors write a summary of their article, and then they give journal club prompt questions. And I choose articles that I think are methodologically interesting, which would engender a good conversation for a journal club. We also have tried to pursue collaborations with the Committee on Education because our material is so good that I hate that it only gets published in an article. I want it to be used in all kinds of teaching venues through the Committee on Education at the ACR, and that's been somewhat successful. And then we've begun to develop some collections of articles on given topics on our website. So if you're a pediatric rheumatologist and you want to know the last dozen articles from PD Rheum from A&R, you can just click on the collection on our website. So those are some of the innovations. I think we're always trying to tweak the journal to be more responsive to authors and the readership. So I'm sure there'll be some other innovations coming your way.
Yeah, it's fabulous. I want to really thank you, Dan, for joining us today and sharing all of your experiences and expertise, telling us what you think the future will hold. I really appreciate you walking us through your work, and I'm very relieved to hear that the smartphones are not yet replacing the magic of rheumatologic care, but probably more to come.
Thank you very, very much, Vicky. I enjoyed chatting.
My thanks today also go to rheumatology innovators. It's tough to bring change to fields like medicine, and sometimes it will take a few iterations before a good idea catches on. Thank you all for iterating. Thank you for listening to this podcast. ACR Journals on Air is a production of the American College of Rheumatology. Please follow @ACRheum on social media. Email us at podcast@rheumatology.org and rate and subscribe to our podcast at acrjournalsonair.org or wherever you get your podcasts.